This whole project is just really about trying to inspire people to give in as many ways as possible with as much self-expression and enjoyment as possible. And to trust in the fact that kindness creates kindness, that generosity is infectious, and that if we can, through these 1,000 grants and 1,000 stories, create the drop in a lake that becomes a ripple effect, then let's do it. There were no laws in place that meant a doctor could legally perform a transplant operation to a donor who didn't know the recipient. The thought of, could I do that, was answered by the question, yes, and I'm doing it. It was an easier decision than even putting on my socks this morning. This still kind of gives me those goosebumps, I should say, like just the thought of, well, like if we can find a way to act beyond our in-groups and beyond the community of people or non-human animals who we can see and touch and be thanked by, then we're opening up an almost infinite amount of potential.
Good afternoon, Tom. How are you?
Hi, Jamie. Very good. Lovely to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you again. So many of my guests, it's the first time I've spoken to them and it's just been online, but you and I have actually met in real life, which is a little bit mind-blowing. And we were introduced by previous guests, Zoe Weil, wonderful woman who runs the Institute for Humane Education. So thanks to Zoe for putting us in touch. It was great to meet you in person and to now bring you on as a guest on Sentientism. So thanks for being here.
Jamie, I think about that. We met up in, was it the Wellcome Trust Cafe in London, and we just had a coffee, maybe two. But I've never learned so much over the course of one or two coffees than I did in that hour. So I'm super excited about this next hour.
Wow, that is it's somewhat bizarre for you to say that, given the people you know and the circles you move in. But thank you, that's a deep compliment. Yeah. So you know this already because we're honoured to have you as a subscriber, and I know you've been watching and listening to some previous episodes. But I guess this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions and ones that are oddly neglected, which is why I keep banging on about them over and over again until we get to the right answers or better answers. And they're the questions of fundamental questions of what's real, how do we understand this crazy universe we all share, and how do we go about working out what to believe? But just as importantly, the deep questions of ethics, what matters and who matters, and what are the implications for that? And I have an obvious bias that you know already, given my new banner behind me, which I used at a conference yesterday for the first time, which is I'm trying to popularize and develop this worldview called Sentientism, which you might set against the portfolio of different religious worldviews or other non-religious worldviews like humanism. And it's trying to answer those deep questions in the same way as those other worldviews are. But Sentientism says, let's use evidence, reason, and have compassion for all sentient beings. So on the what's real question, it's very open-minded. It doesn't tell us what to believe, but it says, let's, with humility, use evidence and reason and sort of critical thinking and be open-minded, change our minds when the evidence changes to try and always imperfectly understand the universe. And on the ethical side, again, it's quite open-minded about what system we apply, but it does insist that all sentient beings at least get serious moral consideration and compassion. And a sentient being, in simple terms, is any being that can feel stuff, right? Can experience good or bad things. But I'm talking in these conversations to people about their journeys around those philosophical questions, whether or not they agree with the worldview. So it'd be really interesting to understand your own philosophical journey, how you got to where you are now, but also how that underpins your fascinating work that you do today. So, but before we get onto those questions, how would you best introduce yourself to the audience?
God, I'm terrible, as my mum would say. I'm terrible about sort of explaining kind of what I do. I'm bad at explaining that, but we'll get into our current project, Drop Dead Generous, and it is a little bit sort of left field. But I also, I think for some reason I really struggle almost sort of pigeonholing myself. I don't know. It's clearly an issue I have. My background is in advertising. I've been in creative roles across creative direction and strategy. That was initially with my own relatively small design agency, and then on to work at Meta for my sins in a global creative strategist role there for 7 years or so, both here in London and over in Singapore for 5 years. So I guess I'm a marketing guy in truth, but I've always punctuated my kind of proper work with what I've called, I think, silly boy experiments, just things that are more projects that are more around sort of self-discovery and in the direction of service and doing good and trying to make a difference. And I think I'm just at a point in my life where I'm really fortunate to bring in a lot of my kind of career experience in marketing and in creativity, and now into the space of social good and trying to encourage and champion kindness, generosity, and giving. So my kind of heart and head have fallen into alignment for the time being. But yeah, honestly, if you'd asked me this question a week ago, I probably would have said something very different.
No, that gives us a great flavour. Thank you. And it's fascinating that you've had the chance to bring that sort of ideas of experiments in meaning and kindness, right into the centre of your professional life now as you run Drop Dead Generous, which we'll explore a little bit later on. So, yeah, thank you. Well, let's start then with the first of these crazily deep philosophical questions, the questions about what's real, or more importantly, how do we work out what's real? And one interesting way to that topic, just because it's of its centrality and how people understand the universe, is for my guests to explain their journey with respect to spirituality, religion, and the supernatural, and whether they grew up in that sort of social context, that way of understanding the world, or something that was maybe more naturalistic or agnostic or atheistic or scientifically grounded, or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking has changed over their life, if it has, and how do they think about that stuff now? How do you engage with the reality of the universe?
Yeah, it's great to have an opportunity to reflect on this, really, because of course I'm 39 now, and you tend to live only really knowing kind of what you know and from your own experience. And I think as I look back now, I had really a lovely childhood. I grew up in a beautiful little cottage in the English countryside, and within a kind of family and broader family, and frankly a broader kind of culture and community that didn't really hold religion particularly closely in any way. Life was held kind of lightly and full of humor generally, and yeah, that religion was just not a big part, despite going to schools that were kind of Church of England and so on. I never, I guess, from my family, got a sense that any of that stuff was particularly important. I think as I grew into my teenage years, that sort of that apathy or just total lack of interest in religion started to take a bit more shape, and I think I became quite an aggressive atheist from my late teens through to my 20s.
And before that stage, even while religion was, I guess, very much a background thing, it wasn't important. If someone had asked you as a 10-year-old or 9-year-old, do you believe in God? What do you think you would have said at that point? Was it in the background and you sort of, I guess I believe it, or was it in the background and just not even a question you entertained?
I would have thought you were referring to Le God, who is Matthew Le Tissier, Southampton's best ever football player, and now unfortunately kind of very strange conspiratorials. But
oh yes, an interesting
but
path.
honestly, I didn't. I don't think I really asked myself those questions, much at all. I think it was mostly. It felt like work. It felt like a school lesson that I would want to suppress any conversation around, and it felt. I felt so totally detached from it.
Yeah. So what motivated the sort of angry atheist thing? What was driving the thinking then, do you think? As a teenager, what were you pushing back on?
What was I pushing back on? I think you start to get more conscious of world news, at a certain age, right? And again, I'd love to have said that this happened for me beforehand, but I think once you get to sort of 16, 17, and my first real emotional thought around religion was looking honestly at the history of war and how often it seemed and still seems that religion plays a big part in what people are fighting for or against. And I think I found that very hard. That suddenly made the question of religion, what is and what does it mean to me, feel very human. And again, not I wasn't really seeing many upsides at that stage. I think as well, I developed a view fairly early on that also felt, in fact, I remember reading about the story of Prometheus. And again, I'd love to say this was the poem Prometheus Unbound, but that was way too long for me. But just the spirit of that story, which is this demigod Prometheus stealing fire from Zeus and giving it individually to the people, and for that being tied to a mountain, pushing up a boulder for the rest of his life, having his liver eaten by a vulture for eternity. And I think that kind of poem, that story, really framed what I felt, which was that religion was also a real shame, in that it seemed to give people an opportunity to put through faith, whether their accountability, responsibility, or hope, in the hands of something other than themselves. And I just felt that felt to me, and still does in some way, like such a shame, to give agency to these things somewhere other than yourself. So from a few different angles, again, over the course of probably those angry teenage years, I just started to recognize and think of religion in a way that wasn't positive. And again, this has changed me somewhat recently, but because of course you get to a point in time where you think, wow, so I'm now being so avidly intent on one belief, and that's wrong too. You know, avidly kind of not believing is in itself a belief, and so just really,
and that it can become, if if you think you're 100% sure, in a way that's another form of dogma, or
that's another form of dogma, right? And I think also, I remember in my mid-20s, I had moved to London by this stage, and London, is a big place to be lonely in. If you're surrounded by people, and actually, for the first time in my life, I actually felt quite disconnected socially on a handful of occasions, and had a few really low points. And I have a history of depression, and and I remember at that time, you think, my gosh, how funny it is to be surrounded by people and for there to be a total lack of community. And then you look at the role of community and connection and gathering that religion has enabled and been a central part of in many cultures for many, many centuries. And thoughts like this start to make you think, okay, it's not like you cannot have a binary view on these things, and there are upsides and downsides. And this is something I again, really appreciate in religious communities, is the sense of community and service and connection and regular gatherings. But arguably, this is sort of more practical outcomes rather than, belief systems.
Yeah. And so you're thinking about religion as a sort of, if you like, a social institution as well as a belief system, as moderated. You sort of can see the constructive stuff as well as the challenges as well. Has your way of thinking about epistemology, the facts of the matter, shifted at all, in terms of, the likelihood of beliefs in gods or spirits or deities or something transcendent or something spiritual or something beyond? Has that shifted as well? Or is it more just, I still am reasonably confident those beliefs are wrong, but I can see the positive benefits of community and cohesion and identity within religious organizations?
Yeah, it has shifted. I think the spiritual side of me has become way more open in recent years. And I think that's probably just a natural progression on from, if I'm careful of being dogmatic about anything, then I have to be open to everything. And, again, this is probably very rudimental thinking, really, but if it's not religion in a traditional sense or traditional religions, then the spirituality, on a spiritual sense, just the unknown, and actually the excitement and curiosity that comes with being very open more spiritually, I think has just felt like it's felt like a positive development, just in terms of how I see the world, is just to really embrace being as open as possible in every way.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's at least a couple of ways of, following that type of path. And mine, I guess, I'd probably agree with almost everything you said there about, being humble, being radically open-minded, even to, potentially quite strange ideas, to having curiosity, a sense of wonder about the things you do know, and a sense of wonder about the things you don't, right? So in a way, that's how I describe my own spirituality. But I don't tend to use the word spiritual, because I think that's just what having a naturalistic approach to understanding reality is. So in a way, a lot of people do talk about that as spiritual, but it's spiritual without any spirits, if you like. You're like, well, do you believe in spirits, or do you believe in gods or souls or magic or, an afterlife? They'd say, well, no, I think those are still very unlikely, but this spirituality is more about this sense of humility and connectedness that I can feel even within a very naturalistic way of understanding the world. Whereas other people, it is, no, I do actually think there's a reasonable chance that there are spirits or things beyond the natural world, or genuinely, mystical things that go beyond even our potential understanding. We might never. Which flavor or something between?
Copy and paste. I mean, my use of this word spiritual is new for exactly the reasons that you've just described. It's not. Yeah, it's to represent a kind of radical openness of mind, rather than any genuine thoughts, interests in, anything sort of supernatural, as it were. So yeah, I think you framed that really well.
Yeah, thank you.
For me.
Cool. Well, I find that a fascinating path, and for me, it's the path I really like, because some people do, they stick with a narrowly defined religious worldview. Other people will stay within a religious community for the positive reasons you've defined, but actually move away from the supernatural views, and often move to much more progressive ethics at the same time as well. So, there are many people in most religious communities who are actually atheists or agnostics and have abandoned a lot of the more medieval, ethics too. So that's very common. Then there are people who move away from organized religion but become spiritual but not religious, but they do genuinely still have this sense of the transcendent or the magical, or some, being or consciousness that is outside of our natural world. And others, I think you and me, follow the sort of path of spirituality in that naturalistic sense, right? As a radical humility and an open-mindedness and a curiosity, but ultimately, we're still not going to attribute beliefs or credences to things unless there's actually evidence to back it up. And then there's another group who I think almost fall into the type of dogma you were talking about before, where they have a sort of narrow sort of scientism, where, science has the answers. Here's the list of beliefs that we now believe, and they cannot be challenged. And that can feel like it's become its own sort of dogma. So I don't know if that's a useful portfolio, but I think you and I have probably followed a similar sort of path. So we must be right. I think
we're job done. Right. We're at least right within this Zoom call.
Yeah, exactly. Democratic vote between the two of us, I think we'll carry it. So let's move on to the ethical questions. And I'd like to start with the what matters question. And there's such a portfolio of choices here again, right? Whether you have a common sense, childlike way of thinking about philosophy, which I often think is better than professional philosophy, or you think about things like rights or suffering or utility or being virtuous or care or fairness or justice, right? There's so many different ways of thinking about what do good and bad and right and wrong even mean. And given you grew up in a context that wasn't religious, so you didn't have a religious framework for that. As a kid, how did you start in the very earliest days to think about right and wrong and good and bad? And what did that mean to you as an even younger person than you are now?
There's sort of two experiences I'm thinking of, really. I like I said earlier, I picture the house I grew up in, and it was just so beautiful, Jamie, like a little flint cottage. And all I think about when I think about it is just an enormous amount of flowers and sunshine, and the whole house was surrounded by an orchard that had, at any given time, 10 different ducks and geese and goats and turkeys, and we had 5 cats in the house at least at any one time, 2 dogs. We had a pig called Sausage, which I apologize for, but it was a glorious Vietnamese pot-bellied pig who used to come in the house, and it was so picturesque. I also, I had 2 parents that didn't much like each other's company, and a dad who absolutely loved to drink, and he's been sober for 10 years, and it's, incredibly proud of the sort of journey he's gone on. But I think it's very strange, honestly. So I visualize this sort of beautiful house, and then I actually feel like a lot of sadness there too. And I think that is something I really didn't understand and could not work out at the time at all, because
sort of
it was
aesthetically idyllic, but your experience was,
yeah. But actually, none of it counts if there's not just happiness and love and these kind of things. And of course, then you look at, I look at my dad back then, and he's such a great person, and he is the life and soul of the party. He'll do anything for anyone. But as an addict, he also, he by his own admission, I think put us through a lot, right? And you look up to your dad perhaps more than anyone. And now as been a dad for 5 years, and I realize just what a privileged role that is to play. But I think the big question around ethics was like looking up at my dad and realize you can be both good and bad, at the same time. And for right and wrong reasons. Again, as an addict, I don't blame my dad for what he went through, but I still experienced, the consequences of it. So I think this left me really fascinated in this idea that everybody is good and bad, and it really feels, therefore, that you can take any sense of judgment out of the equation and just focus on in what environments and moments and support systems are people more good than they are more bad. And I think that honestly forms a lot of what I've done, a lot of what I care about, a lot of what I want to do and achieve is actually just looking at things very judgment free and thinking about just behavior change, and how you're looking to enable existing characteristics rather than change them.
Yeah. So you're shifting away from judging an individual, categorizing them in a particular way as good or bad. I'm quite sympathetic to that myself. I'm quite skeptical about the idea of, agency in that deep sense that would lead anyone to really deserve good or bad things as a result of who they are. And the shift instead is, when you're thinking about good and bad, right or wrong, is more to think about specific actions or decisions and the outcomes and the results that flow from them. Is that sort of fair? But you're shifting away from a judgment on the individual generally.
I think so, yeah. And again, a lot of the conclusions I come to, or the sort of conscious decisions I make that inform my worldview and my behaviors, will often, there's one answer here and one answer there, and I don't know for sure, but I know this is the better one to assume, right? I mean, just take, for example, the idea of karma, like whether it's a thing that exists or not, you're better off living as if it does. And I feel the same with this instance here, right? If you can view people without judgment, then that's a respectful thing to do, and I think it's the most empowering thing for you to place for you to start with if you're interested in behavior change and just change in general. So yeah. I'm sort of articulating these things on the fly, I think, but I think that's important to me, and I think probably that kind of childhood experience is why.
Yeah, yeah. And as you're thinking about, those consequences and the outcomes, what is it about those that drives the good and the bad? Is it the suffering and the flourishing of individuals? Is it situations of fairness or injustice or oppression? Is it, or is it a sort of mix of all of those things? What are you thinking about when you're thinking about when things are good or bad for someone?
Oh God,
It can just be a messy mix of all.
it's a really good question.
Above.
It's certainly a mix. But yeah, it's certainly a mix is the easy answer, right? I think what I skew to, though, is back to this point we were talking about earlier in terms of responsibility, accountability, potential. I, you know, I think I'm driven by enabling myself and others to be their best self, and trust in the kind of ripple effect of that. So the injustice, I feel, is just as strong for someone not fulfilling, their potential as it is for the suffering of the person who could benefit from them fulfilling their potential, if you like. So, and again, I don't know why. I think this is a framing for me that feels most empowering, most positive, most exciting. Perhaps I'm sort of safeguarding myself against that question and exposure to suffering. Perhaps I'm just assuming as a given suffering is there, and it's not, to try and I don't need to feed off it or quantify it or anything. It's there. That's not the thing that needs to be established. What needs to be established is how to alleviate it through enabling other people to be their best selves, I guess.
And when you say enabling someone to be their best selves, it seems to me from our conversation last time and just through the pattern of things you've done through your life personally and what you're doing now, that this idea of kindness is central to being our best selves. Is that fair to say that that's, a core part of what you mean by being our best selves?
Yes. I think it's perhaps one of the most obvious human truths that for some reason we ignore or forget. But when we are giving, when we are at our most giving, our most generous, when we are in service of others, we are finding ourselves in situations and meeting people and experiences and looking back on things we've achieved that bring us our own happiness, sense of fulfillment and pride. So yeah, and I think for me it just feels like a total win-win to try and think, well, and I'm almost more interested through the work I do and enabling people to give, or trying to inspire people to give more in all sorts of ways, by the journey and the outcome that they will experience from it. The recipient, their benefits, it's a bonus.
That's fascinating. Yeah,
it's almost cliched, right? But like, it's just true. If you're on a hunt for happiness and meaning, then just be in service of people. That's the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, it's good for the giver as well as the receiver. Yeah,
right. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think a lot of people would agree with what you've laid out there as like kindness is this, convenient win-win that can help the beneficiary and the person who's being kind. But you're quite different because you've actually, I think, experimented practically with this ideas in some really fascinating and some might say quite radical ways. So what's your journey been like in your own life about trying to put that into practice?
Well,
because I'm thinking of the free help idea, and obviously you've taken some quite interesting decisions about parts of your own anatomy that people might be interested in hearing the story of. But have you experimented with this idea of putting this into practice in your own life?
Yeah, and so you're referring to this. There was one, I guess it was a blog. Again, it was one of these silly boy projects, but it was a blog I ran called The Free Help Guy. I was, I think, 24 or 5 at the time. I just got out of an agency I'd set up, and everything was going well. And I thought, but this isn't me, and it's my own thing. That's not right. I just need to leave. And I decided to take 6 months off. And I, on day one, put an advert on Gumtree, which for international listeners might not be too familiar. It's like Craigslist. It's kind of the arse end of the internet, honestly.
Yeah.
And I put an advert on there that said, if anyone needs any help, let me know. And if I can help, I'll help for free and I'll do it anonymously.
And any sort of help, you just said any help, right?
Yeah, I just kept it that open. And I woke up in the morning to 2 emails. The first was from a couple down in Devon who explained to me they had a spare room in their house and they'd given that room to a homeless chap 6 months before. And 6 months on, he'd found a job and his own place to rent, so had moved out. And so their ask to me was, can you help us find someone else to take this room?
So the first ask was someone asking you to help them help someone else.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then the next email was photography student, and she just said, hey, here's my photography portfolio. Can you just give it a click and have a look and let me know what you think? She said, my friends and family say it's great, but what do they know? They love me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm sat, kind of in my boxers in bed one morning, just opening up my emails and thinking, have I ever heard anything more true and profound than that? And that's before I've even kind of got up in the morning. And sure enough, so, for that request, I just fired away a bunch of emails to famous photographers, totally overly familiar. There's a chap called Mick Rock, who's he was famous for photographing the Stones and Bowie and all sorts of people. And I sent him an email saying, hey Mick, hope you're doing well. Long time no see. Didn't know, never met him. And I said, I just wanted to share a friend of mine's portfolio. If you have any thoughts, let me know. And he came back. I think it was he certainly came back. There was one photographer came back and really took a detailed look, said her work is really promising. She specifically seems to like this style, in which case she should think about this camera and all this kind of stuff. So within a day or two, I emailed back this lady saying, look, I love you. I like your work, but I love you. What do I know? Here's what Mick Rock says. Here's what so-and-so says. Here's what.
Awesome.
So this just became a 6-month journey helping random people with random things, from naming babies to finding bone marrow donors. And each and every time I just found myself in the middle of a genuine human problem and person behind it, and just an intention to do what I could. Often I proved myself to be very unhelpful, but it was just a vehicle to meet lots of different people just going through everyday problems. And I think for me that really sparked this idea of this real curiosity for the huge breadth of human problem.
Yeah.
And just how varied and nuanced and yet familiar and resonant people's problems are. And I think the storyteller, the kind of grassrootsy kind of person in me just really got interested in just how rich these stories were and how unbelievably accessible they were actually on a human level. Whereas a lot of traditional charity and social good is almost abstracted because it's causal, it's themed and the suffering is there and all of that stuff in greater quantities, really. But I just think the kind of base level human problem space is it just connects in a different way for me personally, and I think this is something that perhaps a lot of people share. But at a similar time, or actually it was just before this, the year before, I'd read about a lady who donated her kidney to a stranger, and she's called Kay Mason, and actually she was in the papers because not only had she donated a kidney to a stranger, she'd lobbied the government to put in the laws that meant she actually could. Because up until, I guess it was 2010 or 8 or 9, there were no laws in place that meant a doctor could legally perform a transplant operation to a donor who didn't know the recipient. And Jamie, I can't explain, as soon as I was reading this article, the thought of, could I do that, was answered by the question, yes, and I'm doing it at exactly the same time. It was an easier decision than even putting on my socks this morning. And
wow, that easy.
yeah, and it took a year or so to be assessed, and I've found myself going under the knife and giving my kidney to someone I'll never meet, and getting an update every now and again, even now that she is doing fine. I shouldn't know anything about her, but my surgeon was so excited that he gave me a few bits of information. She was a 7-year-old girl at the time, and course, she'd now be sort of 18, 19. And from what I hear, she's still healthy. I've never met her. I never will. But I think these two, I mean, I don't think I can describe the kidney donation as a silly boy project as such, but
No,
these
I don't
two
think any of these things are. I think it's just faux modesty. But if these are silly boy projects, I love them.
Well, there's, yeah, a lot of my work is silly, and that's very intentional, because I think that's an important light trait to have. But the kidney thing, I think I was really exploring there the as I considered it in the early days, and well, to be honest, as I spoke to my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, and my mum, I just said, look, I want to do this. Would you support me on it? And of course, then I get all the questions I probably should have been asking myself, like, is it safe? Can you live with one kidney? Can't you do this when you're older? Because I was only 25 by the time I donated. And it was only at that point that I realized, there's 8,000 people on the waiting list at the time. And, this girl isn't my daughter or sister or cousin, but it is someone's daughter, sister, and cousin. And it makes no difference. It makes no difference. The only difference is that I won't have the proximity to see the impact. And it felt that actually that was a wonderful experience to go through, to do something I passionately believed in, knowing that I would never see the impact, but trusting that impact occurred. And I'm this still kind of gives me pins and needles, just also as goosebumps, I should say, like just the thought of, well, like if we can find a way to act beyond our kind of in-groups and beyond the community of people or non-human animals who we can see and touch and be thanked by, or whatever it might be, then we're opening up, an almost infinite amount of potential. So it, as a kind of thought experiment, really, or as something I wanted to be the kind of person that could go through something like that and come out the other end being happy with the decision despite not seeing the impact. I thought if that occurs in me, then sort of got a superpower, really, of just being like, oh, I'm not limited just to the people next to me or the person down the road.
And that's a fascinating disconnect. I think a really positive one as well, because one of the attractions of immediate proximate acts of kindness is because the benefit you get to feel as the giver, as the helper, in part comes from the thanks, the hug, the kind email, the gratitude, the look in the eyes, right, of the person or the being you've helped. And that's partly how you so to still have that feeling, still feel that part of the win-win, even when you're disconnected, moves you much more to a point of view that is much more independent of your network of personal relationships and who happens to be around you and who happens to be like you, and takes you into what some might think of as a much more sort of colder analytical space of like everybody matters, but you're still engaging in a way where the benefit and the connection of kindness is very visceral and very real. It seems to me like to be it's not just like, I've run a spreadsheet, I've worked out the most effective charity, I donated $100 and off it goes, right? That exercise seems to be both, you will never interact with the beneficiary at all, but that visceral sense of contribution is still very, very powerful for you.
Yeah, and Jamie, I grapple with this to this day, right? Because actually a lot of the work we're doing now is, well, put it this way. So the point we're discussing here is, is as Paul Bloom, who wrote a book called Against Empathy. So as he would say, empathy has an inherent bias. So we are way too inclined to support and act in service of those we know, those that look like us, those that we can understand have the same views, and so on, those that are near us even. And that we have to rationally think our way out of that empathy bias if we're going to, help the most amount of people in the best way, which then becomes very aligned, I think, with effective altruism but perhaps from a slightly different direction, where if you look at the most impact you can create, you have to also look out of your sort of obvious sphere of influence and proximity and to where the most amount of value can be created, which is often, not your neighbor or not in your family member or not your skin color or whatever it might be. However, I also recognize, and I'm actually really curious about the power of the experience of doing something good when you can feel, touch, and see the impact of it. And I almost think of it as, I'm coming to think of this as, from a moral and ethical standpoint, I totally am on board with the Paul Blooms and the effective altruists. And from a policy perspective, if I was in government, I would be thinking this way too. As a sort of mass marketeer, I really can't move too far away from the potential for the everyday person of an experience where they do something in service of others and they get that visceral feeling back through a thank you, through whatever it might be, because that is the thing that's going to make them fall in love with what they did and do it again, and perhaps go on a journey where their sphere of influence goes beyond their empathy bias and starts, and their what they think they can impact goes beyond their in-groups and their proximity and so on. So I think it's such an interesting little subject area, but I actually think both things are true in different circumstances, and maybe the truth lies in the fact that there's probably a journey, that in the average person needs to be taken, where you do look at your in-group first, fall in love with the act of giving, and then transcend to a point where everything, animal and so on, is part of your in-group.
Yeah, thank you. And there's that fascinating mix of, the cold, hard intellectual approach and then the more emotional, intuitive, drive. And some people I think are more one or the other, and some people are a mix of both. But that was a fascinating sort of exploration of those different ways of thinking and how they might relate to each other and how people might even follow a path through them. And you framed the next question beautifully, which is this idea of going beyond those sort of intuitive, relational proximity links and broadening our moral scope out as well. And that links into this question of who matters. And so I'd be really interested in your thoughts about the journey you've gone on there, because again, most of us as kids start up with, like you said, there's good and bad in all of us. And part of that good is at least we feel some sort of compassion for some others, family, friends, those around us, maybe a companion animal at home. And then as we go through our lives, that moral scope shifts and changes, and sometimes in the ways you've been talking about here, where you're like, okay, realizing that others matter when you didn't realize they did, right, in really deep ways. So how would you describe your journey on the who matters question, or where have you got to now? How would you think about who gets to be included in our moral scope?
Well, I think, this is why I replied to the email that I was introduced to you, perhaps within a matter of minutes, because I think it absolutely stands to reason that the who matters is who is the group of who that feel things, and yeah, I can't really think in any other way than there's just this even sense of everyone mattering in equal measure. And, so with our project at the moment, Drop Dead Generous, the sort of overview of that is we're giving $500 to 1,000 people to go and do something Drop Dead Generous or outrageously kind. And it's fascinating because it's essentially, first and foremost, an idea search. We ask people to submit their idea for how they'd spend that money on an act of kindness through our website. And so we're actually learning How do people interpret that brief? Who do they think of when they think of their recipient? Why? And then what do they want to do for them? And so part of this thinking comes from the perspective with this project that it's a social experiment, and the hypothesis is what impact can those 1,000 stories create? So we're less interested in the direct impact of those 1,000 acts of kindness, and we're more interested in what's the impact, what's the level of inspiration and action we can create from the 1,000 stories that come of it.
And then the ripples from those.
Yeah, so often when we look at these ideas, we are really thinking we're putting ourselves in a position of being someone who will hear this story in a few months' time, however it might be told. And how do we feel? How does that make us think differently? How does that provoke us into some kind of action in some way? So as we see these ideas, you kind of realize that there's such a what's the word here? There's such a beautiful levelness. If I don't know the word, I'll just make it up. To any one person's recipient, so we have an idea who's just from someone who's thinking about their mate because they're going through a shitty time and they just recently lost their job and they're going through a handful of things. And then we have ideas that referring to a recipient that is a community of homeless people in a certain space who are totally up against it from a systematic perspective and have little or no hope. And in a strange kind of way, Jamie, like those, like we are not finding ourselves waiting, which group is any more worthy a recipient of this person's act of kindness than anyone else is. And I don't know. I don't know if I make any sense now, but I don't know if that comes back to the sense of like liberty and ability to focus on other areas when you just take the judgment away from, who matters more than any one other person who's like, if everyone matters equally, what's the idea? What do they want to do for this person? How inspiring will that be as a story?
And in that sense, you're trusting the recipient to form their own judgment of that rather than stepping in and having some sort of scale or judgment on. Yeah, it's a very different form of assessment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. And what sort of, as you're getting the responses coming in, because obviously it would be great to drill into this a little bit more when we talk about a better world as well. The stories you've mentioned there are about maybe a friend or a group that someone knows locally. Are you getting some that stretch that intimacy and that proximity sense of kindness further? Are there people saying, I want to do an act of kindness, which is to a remote group that I can't engage with directly? Or are there people that are going beyond humans as recipients? Because in a way, this who matters question is less about, how do we rank people or beings? It's more about just who gets included in the first place. So you must be getting an interesting picture of who people think does matter.
Yeah, so this is exactly our problem, but also sort of the whole thing's an experiment. So what we're, maybe this is just us being blindly kind to ourselves, but at every kind of moral quandary or every little kind of mutated gene that the project sort of sparks off into, we are just like, well, this is the direction it's going in. Let's just follow that. So one thing we're finding, for example, and it's back to our point around in groups versus out groups, Paul Bloomisms and you're not, is the ideas that come in that have an individual recipient often feel like that is going to be a more relatable story for people to connect to. So actually one of the observations is if a recipient is an individual versus a group, we see more potential in the stories if it's an individual rather than a group. The same thing is true, honestly, if the person submitting an idea has an emotional connection to their recipient, which often means it's because they're in their in-group, it's someone in their network of friends or immediate community and all these kind of things. So it's just totally contradicting everything we said around the sort of total openness of everything. But I think it's because our filter is coming from the lens of being basically a storytelling project, and it's this empathy bias that is what attaches us, or what drives us
That's
as
where it starts from. Yeah.
consumers of stories. Yeah, and we're just hoping to spark something in people who hear these stories and read about these stories to start their journey becoming an effective altruist and someone who can look at the whole world. So yeah, it's fascinating because we had an idea review session. We do it every Friday morning just before I hopped on this call, and we had 3 different ideas that kind of blew my socks off, actually. And yeah, and it probably is because this person is generally looking at their own sphere of influence and thinking, what is the most amount of impact I can have here? And you feel the emotion, the sort of the energy and the emotion, because of that proximity between the person with the idea and the recipient they're thinking of.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the other interesting dimensions, I think, in the way humans think about ethics is that nearly everybody would sign on with this idea of kindness being a good thing, and maybe there's a mutual benefit to both sides. And when it comes to moral scope, many people will also quite naturally extend that even beyond the human species as well. So kindness to animals is sort of, again, almost everyone would tick the box and say, of course, being kind to animals is important. As we know, that isn't reflected in the way human society engages with most animals, whether it's in the wild or labs or farms, right? So there's that strange disconnect between, a theoretical default human value and the reality of what we actually do in the real world, which is a central theme, as you can imagine, for this podcast, right? So on that question of going beyond humans, what's your journey been there? Because you talked already about growing up in this, idyllic place, actually surrounded by non-human animals as well as humans. What's your journey so far been on the non-human animal story, and how do you think about that now?
Yeah, as I said, I for 38 years, I absolutely loved animals, but fairly shamefully, especially with salt and pepper. And it's astonishing to say that, and I crack a bad joke without wanting to be disrespectful, but it's I did not connect my love for animals with with the idea of, with the suffering that they go through as a result of being kind of on the menu, right? And in products and elsewhere. And it wasn't until this January, and I spent a couple of weeks with Zoe Whale, who you mentioned earlier, who introduced us, who who runs the Institute for Humane Education, and she's currently vegan CrossFitter of the year, and just an astonishing humanitarian. And she within a few minutes of speaking, and the context was with a group of people working in the sort of social good space. So she sort of quite quickly realized I was a meat eater and started giving me shit straight away. And I think it was honestly like such a joy not being preached to, and just actually being, quite rightly made fun of. And she was just pointing out with so many smiles, and again with a lightness, that this was a huge contradiction, and that.
But you didn't take that as preaching?
I didn't really, because she picked her moments to sort of probably preach a little bit more than just take the piss out of me, but because for 2 weeks, this kind of went on, and it would keep coming up, and every time I don't know, it's mad, isn't it? Like, you tell me why. I am someone that cares, and I love animals. But for whatever reason, and I told you this when we met, and again I grapple with this. So I at the end of this 2 weeks, we went for a walk, and the night before I was lying in bed, and frankly we'd got so close, and she lives out in Maine, and I live in London, and I thought, I'm not going to see her for ages. This is sad. What can I do to sort of honor the person she is and the work she does? And I thought, oh my God, if I tell her I'm going to become a vegetarian because of her, and because of what she stands for and because of her life's work. And to really make that decision and change in behavior in honor of her, then I think that would be really special to her. And so we went for a walk the next morning, and I said, hey, like I'm a vegetarian. Like it's just happened. We hadn't eaten meat for those 2 weeks anyway, so it happened a couple of weeks before. But I said, I want you to know that I'm doing this because of you and because of everything you stand for. And bless her, she just broke down in tears. She, like it was such a special moment. But for me, that was the thing. And now, like, it's the thing that I think of the smile, the moment I told her smile. Every time I'm in a position in the supermarket or looking at a menu or whatever, and I'm making what is still like a conscious decision to not eat meat, just a few months in, and I think of her, and at no time has it felt like a sacrifice of anything. It's felt like a complete honor every time I find myself making a conscious decision because of Zoe. But of course, Jamie, the absurdity there is that I had to rely on a human and also their reaction to my decision in order to change my behavior and in order to continue, to continue to not eat meat or animal products. So like, I don't know. It's fascinating. It's such a, I love how it's come about. It feels right. It feels long overdue. But then I'm also like, how funny that it took that experience and the way I got there mentally to actually act on it.
I find it fascinating. And I think this topic is, if for anyone who has even a minimal interest in human psychology or sociology, I think almost this is the perfect case study just for illustrating these sorts of challenges. I mean, my own journey was much longer than yours, right? But the path you've gone through there, the different paths other people follow, some of which are intellectual, some of which are emotional. But yours is a really interesting case because, in a sense, like you said, the prime motivation was not really a concern for the non-human animal victims, but it was almost as a gift to Zoe. And one interesting thing about this whole space of ultimately boycotting animal products and veganism generally is that people actually come to the practice in different ways. So for some people, it is a moral transformation. They suddenly realize what's going on in farming, or they, have some realization, or they see a video, or they read a pamphlet, or they have a conversation and the light goes on and it's just, this is wrong, I'm going to stop doing it. And those are quite wonderful, but quite rare people. For other people, it is a moral transformation, but it takes a long time because the social inertia and the psychological inertia just sort of holds us back from what is actually practically, for most of us, particularly in the rich world, a pretty easy thing to do practically, but the social and psychological stuff slows us and holds us back. Other people get to the practical choices through other things, right? It might be an environmental concern because of deforestation and emissions and pollution and whatever else that's going on because of those industries, so they boycott. Or it might even be a health concern where people are thinking about, addressing diabetes or cancer risks or whatever it is, just some general health. It's a diet shift. But for the people that didn't go down that route because of a moral reason, I'm really interested in their stories, that what happens afterwards, because once you've boycotted, for example, an industry or a system, and you're no longer complicit, for many people, it almost frees them up to think in a different way about the morality. So there are quite a few people who maybe, boycotted all animal products for environmental or health reasons, but then the morality layers in and reinforces their choice later on. Has that shift, how is it, I should ask you a question. Sorry, this is terrible interviewing technique. How has your thinking about this topic of non-human animal ethics and animal agriculture specifically shifted since you've taken the decision? Does it still feel like something you do for Zoe?
It does,
Yeah.
I not much has shifted otherwise. And I wonder why, honestly. I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day who's been a vegan for 10 years or so, and he talked about a sort of moral transformation in a moment, which is quite rare. And I said, what made you make the decision? He said, I was in my garden flipping burgers on a barbecue, and there was a cow in the field next door looking at me straight in the eye. He said it was the last time even thought about having me.
And that was it.
Yeah, that was it. And I think, yeah, I actually, answering this question really honestly, I'm almost wholly reliant on that moment with Zoe and the memory of it, and some additional self-serving reality since, right? I generally feel better, some sort of health benefits of, whatever. But I have to be honest, like the moral side of it, I'm, if anything, I'm conscious amongst my peer group of making people feel uncomfortable for my choice. We had dinner the other day and at a friend's house, and there was meat on the menu, and I picked around it, and I was just horrified at the idea that she would think I was, all of that kind of stuff. So I don't even have the moral ammunition to speak about it.
Yeah, I
Or
understand.
I feel shame when I say this, honestly, Jamie, because it's it's strange, and it is like a
It's bizarre, isn't
contradiction
it?
with
Yeah.
with anybody really. But I think in my kind of line of work and the work I do that makes me feel incredibly alive, it's just a massive contradiction.
Yeah. But I think it comes back to what you were saying earlier on, which is, I think your compassion for other humans recognizes the social context they're operating in. I think that's partly why you try and hold back from judging people, and you want to acknowledge the context you're in. And you and I are in those contexts as well, right? And I think I sometimes think of this thought experiment where if you imagined, a completely vegan world where we didn't exploit, harm, or kill animals for trivial reasons at all, this would just be so easy, right? I mean, no one would create animal agriculture. No one would feel this pressure or tension. No one would be nervous about how they're making a host feel, or it would all just lock into place. It is really the social infrastructure and the institutions and the inertia that I think is the heart of the problem. So that makes it, and that doesn't trivialize it, right? But it makes the moral dilemma that much more piquant and difficult and challenging to navigate. But we all have to, I guess. Well, thank you. That's been a really honest and interesting exploration of that topic. I guess the final question, which you've queued up already beautifully, is how do we make a better world? So on the one hand, I like to explore with my guests if they have some sort of grand utopian vision for the potential future of humanity and our impact on wider sentientity as well, if you like. But it would also be really good to drill into your, vision for Drop Dead Generous and how that fits into that role. What would your dream be for how Drop Dead Generous, what it is, how it works, what it's like to go through it, but then this idea of the ripples and, how do you think what sort of influence could it have on wider culture?
Yeah, actually, and I don't think I can answer this question of what we hope it will become without explaining kind of where it came from. So I was lucky enough to work with a chap called Chris Anderson, who runs TED Talks. Him and I chatted, must have been a handful of years ago now. I was busy working at Meta, feeling like I was working for the devil and thinking, my gosh, like this product is these products are not net good for society. And I'd handed in my notice and we jumped on a call, and he said he wanted to write a book about kindness in the age of the internet and how it's this human trait that has benefited us for civilizations, and yet now it can spread like never before possible because a story of one person doing one thing can spread and influence and inspire many, many others. And yet this thing, the internet, is almost doing the opposite. It's amplifying divisive content and suppressing good news and good stories. So he wrote this book called Infectious Generosity. I had sort of a front row seat as he wrote it and as he got input from all these TED speakers and specialists from various fields, and wrote this beautiful book, just again reframing kindness and generosity in the age of the internet. Once the book got published, Chris being Chris, who's all just about big ideas really. He just said, go away and think of the craziest idea you can think of, and come back to me, and let's see if we can make it work. So using the book Infectious Generosity and the sort of the spirit of it, we put together this idea of a social experiment called Drop Dead Generous, where we would give away money as a spark for people to go and carry out an act of kindness. But alongside that money, we are doing our best to give them also as much trust as they can feel and permission to express themselves and be as creative and as imaginative as they can be. As I said earlier, the hypothesis is that these, can we make these stories spread, and what would the impact of those stories spreading be? So hence wanting people to express themselves, be creative and imaginative, that's what we think will make more compelling and engaging stories. So we're really, what we're trying to do with it, honestly, Jamie, is there's a couple of things. We're trying to show that someone else's problem is a blank canvas for whatever you want to do for them. Like, we often think about someone going through this thing and what's the most practical thing I can do? What's the most practical thing you can do, plus all the joy and love and experience you can give on top of that, just to elevate it. So I think one of the thoughts is, well, if we can just show that actually the way in which we can go about helping others can be an amazingly expressive experience, then perhaps we'll tap into something more interesting. But really, I think without being too reductive, right, as you look around in the world today, I think one thought, again, that is part of the conclusion of the book is, if more than half of us gave more than we took, we're probably going to be all right as we look forward at the future. And so as a project, or as someone who cares about the future and thinks even in a reductive way like that, actually, I think a really beautifully simplified way like that is, what are you going to focus on? Are you going to focus on what people take and reducing that, or are you going to focus on the fun area, which is what can people give and how can they do it and how can they enjoy themselves in the process so they do it more, and how can they do it in a way that other people hear about so they do it. So this whole project is just really about trying to inspire people to give in as many ways as possible, with as much self-expression and enjoyment as possible, and to trust in the fact that kindness creates kindness, that generosity is infectious, and that if we can, through these 1,000 grants and 1,000 stories, create the drop in a lake that becomes a ripple effect for something good, then let's do it. And the experiment will run for 2 years, and I mean, every decision we're making is as if it's a 20-year project. Truth is, we'll run out of money in 2 years, so we've got a bit of a milestone. But yeah, our job as the sort of curators of it, and I'm working with an amazing chap called John Sweeney, who we actually wrote about in the book as someone who'd had done some amazing work in the sort of space of giving, is to, as I said earlier, distribute these grants, make people feel incredibly trusted, make them feel like they have permission, and then follow the signals of where this project is going and just try and enable that as much as possible. What are the ripple effects, and what tools and programs and everything can we put in place to try and spread it as further as we can?
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful thing to be a part of, because as I was saying earlier, it brings, I guess it's sort of marketing kindness in a new way, is the intention, and it's the cause is close to my heart, but actually the approach of really treating it like an experiment is been really joyful as well, because back to the humility of just not knowing, like, we don't know what we're doing, we don't know what will happen, and so all we've got to do is be as observant as we can and jump on the things that are interesting and try and enable them moving forward.
Yeah, I love it. And so it's that humility, because it is an experiment. You're saying, we don't know how it's going to play out. Let's see. But also that trust in the participants, right? You're granting them autonomy, trusting them to do the right thing and seeing where they go with it. And one of my pet habits with this sentientism project is doing a find replace on the word human and putting sentient in as well. So we've looked at, what might a universal declaration of sentient rights look like. We've thought about ideas of sentientist democracy or politics or culture or law, and you can do it with almost everything, right? And one interesting one for me in this context is taking the idea of humanitarianism, where people will instinctively think of kindness and helping other humans. And this word has got, sentientism has got too many syllables, but wait for this one, sentientarianism, I don't know, whatever it is, right? But taking the idea of humanitarianism or charity or giving or kindness and blowing that out even broader to think about sentient beings. And that was part of the conversation we had. And I was really interested to hear that I think one of your first applicants was actually, suggesting they would be helping non-humans, right? So although many people I think would go into this project thinking about, it's about kindness, which humans can I help? Already not all of your applicants are, thinking within the human species. They're already going beyond, but
yeah, it's so when we met for a coffee and you put forward, you pushed me on this, didn't you? You said, look, it's this, obviously I guess the grants are only available to humans, but how are you, what's your criteria based on the recipients of their act of kindness being kind of non-human? And it's funny, again, I had barely thought about it. We have barely any criteria on the website. We want to see what comes in and just and go with what comes in. But at the moment you pushed me, and I thought, God, yeah, we've not explicitly said, that as a recipient you can think of humans and non-humans. I think we kind of thought it as a given. And then actually on my way back home, I looked through, we have a sort of insane kind of back end system we've built for all of these ideas and tracking the grants, and we've got very geeky about it. But and so we can even toggle, like, how many of these ideas have a recipient that's an animal or addressing, what's the cause behind it and so on. And actually I think it was the second idea we funded was a Singaporean software engineer who wanted to build a food dispenser for his local community of street cats. And we thought that was really beautiful. But the twist on his idea was that he was going to he's in the process of building, he's going to live stream the food dispenser. And whenever a human donates to the local cat charity, it dispenses food. So he's connecting humans to it. So again, and that is the bit I really love about it. And again, it's the human bit. We funded an idea this morning.
Us humans are the ones with most of the power, right? So it makes sense to focus on humans being kind, right, for the moment.
Yeah. And it's that layer, the live streaming, connecting humans to donations, that is what makes that idea infectious and have ripple effects, right?
Yeah.
But we funded an idea this morning, and I think this will give people a sense also of the level of absurdity and silliness and just pure joy that we're really willing to kind of bring into consideration with the grant giving. There's a lady in Poland who runs a horse sanctuary, and she has a 31-year-old horse who's been a sort of therapy horse and by all accounts, a stalwart for the local community for many, many years. And she wants to host a birthday party for this horse. And
love it.
Just invite people to bring a present for the horse, and who knows what people will bring, but basically to show gratitude to this horse, to celebrate it. And so I don't know, it's.
I love that. I love that example again, because it's exactly the sort of thing where if you put it in a spreadsheet and tried to calculate the benefit, right, you might come up with one answer. But when you think about this as a cultural intervention, a sociological intervention, a psychological intervention, which is getting, potentially quite a few human beings to deeply appreciate the perspective of a non-human being, show them respect, ritualize that. And, and again, I'm maybe a little naive about this, but I just love this idea that there could be ripples and second and third and fourth and nth order effects on all of those people's lives and the way they behave to each other and to other non-human animals. And I'm not naive enough to think that will be some, instantaneous ethical transformation for them all. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just programmed to like those sorts of ideas. But
yeah, and I agree. Actually, if you think of it from a sort of story theory perspective, if you think most stories are kind of basically one of 6 story structures, so we're getting a lot of ideas that where the intention is essentially to show gratitude to
Yeah.
someone or something, and so again, as this idea came in to show gratitude to this horse through a birthday celebration, we immediately think of 6 other ideas we've funded over the last couple of months of our 160 we funded so far, that all sorts of different people showing gratitude to different sentient beings in different ways. And actually, the story of uh, lots of people showing gratitude in different ways, it's the same story in different ways, and it sort of becomes richer the more versions of that story you have. For example, one of these sort of adjacent projects is a lady who wants to find a way to encourage the LinkedIn community to show gratitude to their best business partners and suppliers and all this kind of stuff. And I like this because it's kind of boring. It's like B2B, the community, the recipients are B2B businesses, and the platform is, the space in which this act of kindness is going to happen is on LinkedIn. But I think that comparison of like, this is what gratitude looks like if you're on LinkedIn thinking about someone you work with, or if you're, you live in a village and there's a local animal that's just been an ever present, pillar of that community for however long. So, again, I just love that there are many ways to tell the same story, and especially if those different ways span humans and non-humans.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. Now, one thought I had just this morning, as I was thinking about our conversation is, and I'm not sure this fits into the scope of Drop Dead Generous, so it may not be directly relevant, but it was just a thought that popped into my head is, people see acts of benevolence, helping others, as obviously kind, right? That's what people think of when you think of kindness. But actually stopping a harm that you're doing, I would argue, is also an act of kindness, but people don't tend to think of it that way. And there's again, this is sort of, I think there's a real difficulty here, but because to help someone else when you don't need to can feel like a positive and a joy. And it's, because there is a degree to which I'm going out of my way or I'm doing something to help someone else, and you get that benevolence, warmth, and that fuzzy feeling. Whereas to be kind to someone by stopping harming them is psychologically very difficult, because you have to acknowledge your complicity first. And does that make sense? Because it partly links back to this. I don't want to bang on about the animal agriculture thing as well, but I think that's part of the psychological challenge there. Stopping harming someone is almost also an act of kindness, but it doesn't feel the same as, additional benevolence. Does that make sense? I don't even know if there's a question there.
What we're really struggling to do, and what we desperately want to do, is to totally break away from the perception of kindness and a traditional act of benevolent act. And there's lots of reasons for that, honestly. I think that traditional perception is just very narrow. It's actually often very nice and lovely, and in many ways inaccessible, because it doesn't have a rawness or a truth or a conflict within it. And I think this goes back to what I love doing as the free help guy. All those things existed because these were everyday problems from real people, and so we're, put it this way, we're really on the hunt for any idea that challenges that kind of preconception, that shows kindness as an act of courage, or kindness as an act of inaction, or kindness as an act of protest. So we're really showing that tension. I mean, again,
and is that partly how? Because the other thing I thought I had before I let you go is one of the most, as we look honestly at human psychology, I think one of the saddest things I find is this idea of do-gooder derogation. I don't know if you've heard of this, which is essentially you see someone doing good and you derogate them, you criticize them and challenge them, often as an expression of your own guilt, or because you think they are doing empty virtue signaling and just showing off and don't genuinely hold those virtues themselves, right? And my sense to me with this Drop Dead Generous thing is that's one of the things you're trying to sidestep or counter, because you're trying to create a different feeling about being kind and generous. Is that how do you?
Yeah, I'm hyper aware of this idea, and you see it play out, in internet culture hugely, right? Just people calling out others for virtue signaling. And the danger of that is it just becomes such a powerful disincentive to, if not do the thing, then at least talk about the thing you did. And in talking about sharing your story, that's the potential for the ripple effects, right?
Yeah, because there can also be this weird thing where people think it's more virtuous not to talk about the good thing you've done, and it's like, well,
yeah. Well, this is a big problem within the philanthropy community at the moment. Whereas it's been common practice to sort of donate a load of money to a university and slap your name on a library, and and quite right too. Why not? But of course now there's I think there's such a fear for philanthropists of getting called out in some way that it just becomes a very easy decision to go, okay, well, I won't spend part of my life trying to give my money away if I'm going to get criticized for some kind of nuance within it. So it's really dangerous.
And I know we're not going to get much empathy for billionaires, but it almost seems that billionaires who give away most of their fortune get a lot more hassle than the billionaires who just spend it on yachts. It's exactly. Like this seems weird to me, right?
It is, but that's where our culture is, and I say it exists whether you're a billionaire philanthropist or whether you're just someone on your Instagram talking about this little act of kindness you did and sort of getting judged for it somehow. So yeah, again, this is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night, honestly, because I think part of this, I don't know the solution yet, Jamie. As with any solutions out there, I don't know them yet. But yeah, it's this weird place where culture is at the moment, where being a do-gooder is a derogatory term, and it's a huge disincentive, and it's a massive barrier to the good people do spreading.
Yeah.
So we got to find a way to kind of take that back.
And from what I've seen of Drop Dead Generous so far, I mean, it feels to me like you've got a really compelling approach here where for the individual involved, it feels like a joy, right? It's freeing. It's not a sacrifice. It's a positive thing. It's exciting. It's life affirming. And the stories you're generating, I think, are the sorts of stories where people will jump on and enjoy, and it will encourage people. I don't see it falling into that. Do get a derogation of virtue. I think I'm an amateur here, right? You're the marketing genius, but it feels like you're getting the tone and the vibe of that right, which I guess is part of your plan.
Thank you for saying that. Hopefully, look, one thing we recognized early on is that one way to get around this fear of talking about the good you're doing for these reasons is actually to build a way in which we or someone else can tell your story on your behalf. So actually immediately, like, you're not bragging about it so much. In fact, the main way we have of collecting and sharing stories at the moment is we just have an answer machine on our website, and people share their story with us as if they're leaving an answer machine message, and that just goes up on Instagram and soon on a podcast feed. And so actually, even that, so we're not telling their story on their behalf per se, but we are always saying to these people is, like, your story is a gift to the world. Like, would you be willing to give your story to the world? And so you're not like reporting to us, you're not preaching to anyone, you're just putting this out there, and we're very grateful for you doing it. And I think the other thing, again, back to sort of storytelling, it's like, well, beyond the act of kindness here, what are the other narratives going on that speak to people in different ways beyond the message of do good or I did this good thing, you should too? What was your motivation? What's the backstory? How did you make it entertaining? Like all of this stuff. I think these stories then can become, again, more just broadly human interest stories that have, if still maybe at the core an act of giving, but actually the story you're telling is what your worldview is, or how you approach this creative challenge, or the way in which you put this exhibition on for your friend, whatever it might be. So it's not just, I did this good thing, look, it's, this is how I express myself. And I think there's the transaction of sharing a story and hearing a story then becomes, in a way, just more multifaceted, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, many congratulations on it. It's a wonderful, inspiring, hopeful project. And I just hope, it continues to succeed over the next couple of years and continues thereafter too. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation before I let you go? But also critically, how can people follow you, get involved with Drop Dead Generous, engage with some of the stories, maybe even apply for some of your grants? What's the best way of connecting?
So our website is dropdeadgenerous.org. We're at Drop Dead Generous elsewhere on the internet. I would love for as many people listening to first think about who it is, human or otherwise, who really could do with you stepping up and just expressing yourself through an act of kindness, and heading to the website and filling out the form and submitting an idea. We review, as I said earlier, the ideas every Friday. So there's not too long to wait. The other thing, kind of more broadly, I would say is, and we do say it on the website somewhere, the more this project is in the hands of everybody else rather than just us, the more potential it has to go in an interesting direction. So we really just want to be as radically open and collaborative as we possibly can be. We are only a couple of people, so resources are limited, but if someone has a feeling for something we could be doing or something we could be doing better, we just want to hear it, because I think our jobs is just to steward this intention in the right direction. And the more thoughts and minds and sort of good vibes that get sent our way, the more interesting place it will be steered in. So what I'm saying is, we're a blank canvas for anybody else's broader ideas for the project and what we should be doing. So I would totally invite anyone to reach out. I'm Tom at dropdeadgenerous.org. So
brilliant. I'll include your details in the show notes so people can reach out. And you mentioned a podcast potentially.
Well, we recorded a podcast and then listened to it and all sat there and cringed for an hour. So we've canned.
I know that feeling.
We've canned what we're initially intending, but we are going to just create a feed of voice notes. So the answer machine messages come in, they go straight up to a podcast feed. So again, in the spirit of trust, the first time we hear our stories will be actually from our own kind of podcast feed now. So that feels appropriate. But generally, from a content and media perspective, over the next 18 months or so, we're just going to be trying everything in every way and see what becomes interesting and what works. So across our socials especially, we'll see all sorts of mostly weird and hopefully wonderful attempts to amplify and celebrate all the amazing stuff people are doing with this money we've funneled their way.
Sounds great. Well, I'm following you everywhere already, and I'll look out for the podcast as well. It's like little rays of sunshine into what can sometimes be, gloomy days. So yeah, thank you for that too. Cool.
Awesome.
Well, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. It's been great to have you as a guest on Sentientism, and again, lovely to add you to the guest list as well as actually having you met in person. So please do stay in touch, and I'm fascinated to see how Drop Dead Generous develops too. So
yeah, of course, Jamie. Thanks. And I was excited an hour and a half ago about this time, and it's been wonderful. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great conversation. All right, well, stay in touch.
Thanks, Jamie. Have a good weekend.